today we're going to look at Queen Elizabeth before she was queen. As a child, up to the time through her marriage. And Wednesday, it's really unusual that I'm going to be here all week. On Wednesday, we're going to look at from the time she found out that she was queen, when her father died, up to the modern day. And then on Friday, I think is one you're going to really enjoy, because it's what it's like to be a queen. We're going to look at what her daily schedule is. What does she eat? What does she wear? Why does she wear it? What's her house look like? And then we're going to answer that big question that everybody always wants to know. Why does she carry the handbag and what's in it? And I actually, there's a lot of different sources on that, but the one that's I've got is an actual person that was her dresser. So that we're going to be accurate with that. So again, stop me as we go along, and if you have a question or comment, and I'll be glad to answer it. It's good to be queen.
Sure.
That sure it is. That is one of the. I'm going to try something first. Is that better?
Mm-hmm.
That quote is from one of the pillows at one of her houses. She had it stitched in. It's good to be queen. Well, it certainly is. And these are her early years. These little bit of background to this. Her great grandmother was Victoria. And Victoria was forever, you know. She reigned for such a long time, and she was had unbelievable amounts of grandchildren, and with that. And then she died in January 1901, and she was succeeded by her son. And I always love this quote. I have no objection whatsoever to the notion of the eternal Father, but every objection to the concept of the eternal Mother, meaning his mother, because she served so long. And he really was quite old when he got on the throne. I suppose Charles has to feel the same way. Charles, I'm 70, and Charles is 73, I think. So he has a ways to go yet, probably, before he gets to the throne. He got on the throne, and on May 6, 1910, his son took over and became, it was Edward, and then he became George V. George V was the king during World War I. And kind of an interesting sidelight, do you have any idea who those two people are? I'll tell you, I took British history, and this is a picture I required my kids to know. Okay, are they brothers?
Yes.
Yes. How many agree they're brothers? They sure look alike, don't they? They aren't brothers. They're cousins. That's George. That's Tsar Nicholas of Russia.
Oh, wow.
And he's about to be overthrown and killed. But don't they look alike? And you should see all the other cousins look like them. It is truly remarkable. That is the wedding picture of George to Mary of Teck. And that's all their children. They had a huge amount of children, of which those two. Now, this is not a trick question. Are they brothers? Yeah, they are. Yeah, they're George's brother, George's children. Do you have any idea who this one is? That's Edward VIII, who's going to abdicate eventually. And that's George, Brother Bertie.
But didn't one son go down in the English Channel?
Yes. One of the, yeah. And that is Edward, Albert, Christian, George, Andrew, Patrick, David. Don't you love their names? They could only have about 2 or 3 more, but that's Birdie. That's the brother. And that's his brother, Edward. And this allowed for Albert, Frederick, Arthur, George. Who's that? And he becomes, of course, George the fifth. Now, on April 26, 1923, Prince George, and he was known as Bertie at the time, it was actually Prince Albert. Prince Albert married Elizabeth. And it was one of the very first royal weddings to actually be published. They actually filmed it, little bits and pieces of it, and you could actually go to the movie theater and see their wedding. And there they are. It's a happy couple. The woman will eventually become the Queen Mother. Okay? And this is where they lived. They lived in Mayfair. They lived in a very nice apartment house, a house that had apartment in it. It was a huge apartment. As you can see, it had 25 rooms. And in a ballroom. I think I could have survived in that house. They were the Duke and Duchess of York, by the way, at the time. And then April 1926 occurs, and there's all sorts of chaos in the world. There's huge riots in India. Violet Gibson, who I have to say I never could have told you who she was, tried to assassinate him. Who's he?
Mr. Gibson.
See, I love people that have good answers like that. Actually, that guy looks exactly, put a uniform on him.
Is it Prince Frederick?
Nope.
Is that a man or a woman?
Violet Gibson's a woman.
Oh.
She tried to assassinate this guy. Put a uniform on him? Oh, put it back. I forgot I didn't have. That's Mussolini. Benito Mussolini. Yeah. So in 1923, she tried to assassinate him. And the warlord Zhuang Zuolin entered Beijing. He was overthrowing the Chinese government. And the new Shah of Iran was being crowned. There was a huge coal mining problem. Look at this, what they offered. The coal mine owners offered a 13% pay cut. Not a pay raise, but a pay cut. And then they were going to increase the working hours from 7 to 8 hours a day. So imagine a pay cut and you had to work longer. So there's all this chaos going on in the world. That's the miners protesting for it. And then at 2:40 a.m. on April 21st, a baby was born. And that is Elizabeth. Isn't she cute? They took the picture just days after she was born. A few weeks before she was born, the Duke and Duchess of York had moved to their Mayfair house of the Duchess's parents. They are all Countess of Swarthmore. So that's why they were in Mayfair. And over time, the house has been destroyed. It's no longer there. Where Elizabeth was born, that house is gone. It's now a Chinese restaurant. And that's an actual picture of it. It took me a while to find it, but I found it. Quick sidelight. For centuries, it had been the custom for the Home Secretary, we would say Secretary, we don't exactly have this in our cabinet. Not quite Secretary of State. Okay, the Home Secretary to be present at the birth of an heir to the throne. I mean, literally, when they're giving birth, the woman was giving birth, the Home Secretary had to be there. Why?
Witness. Records.
Pardon?
Keep with records.
You're in the right area. He said, keep it right.
But Elizabeth
Witness.
wasn't supposed to be, wasn't thought of as the heir to the throne, was she? At the time she was born?
No, she was not the direct heir, but she was close enough. She would have been third in line. That the Home Secretary should have been there. Okay,
For the person.
why should he been this Home Secretary? Why did they always have to be at the birth of the heir of the throne?
Record the date of her birth.
To record the validity of the birth.
Validity.
The validity of the birth. That the baby had actually been born. Right. Exactly. Get the date and get the validity of it. Because there were times when they thought that the baby had died and they had substituted another baby. And so they wanted to make sure that the baby was legal. And King George, though, said that that didn't have to happen here. So the Home Secretary didn't have to be in the delivery, to see the delivery. But Elizabeth's birth wasn't without complications. Buckingham Palace announced this. Previous to the confinement, a consultation took, oh, it should be took, I have to change it. And a certain line of treatment was necessarily adopted. Now, doesn't that sound royal? You know, what in the world do you think was the special treatment?
Oh, a wet nurse.
No witness. They said no witness.
No, but a wet nurse.
Oh, wet nurse.
Yes.
Oh, that's a good guess. No, but it's a good guess. A cesarean section. Elizabeth was born by cesarean section. And they didn't want to mention that in public. They just said, there's something special was going on here. And she was named Elizabeth Alexandra Mary. She was immediately consigned to her mother's old nanny, Clara Knight. And I was telling somebody asked about me putting this together, and I actually edited some of this morning before I went to babysit. And this was one of the things I suddenly put in. I found the picture that I was looking for, Clara Knight. And she was christened at Buckingham Palace with Jordan water. That's holy water. From the River Jordan over in Palestine, they actually brought it over and had her christened with that. But she was so fussy that that nurse put dill water in for her to drink. Now, have any of you ever used dill water to quiet a baby?
No.
Yeah, I never heard of that either. That sounds terrible.
What kind of water?
Dill.
Bill.
You put, like dill pickles? You put dill in water and the baby was to drink it. Ugh. I like dill, but I don't, ooh. I won't be feeding that to a baby. George said, we always wanted a child to make our happiness complete. They were thrilled with her. One night, Elizabeth, when she was just 3, she knocked on the door. And her mother called out, who's there? And she said, Lilibet, the princess. She didn't quite get the thing. Now, notice the name, Lilibet. Okay. Why did she say Lilibet?
She couldn't say
Elizabeth.
Right, she couldn't say Elizabeth. She couldn't say a word Elizabeth, and she said Lilibet. Right. Now, do you know modern day Lilibet?
Harry's.
Harry's child is named Lilibet. Right. The Duchess of York believed in modern dress. She favored shorter skirts for her daughter and cotton over wool. Remember, we're in the 1920s. So that was considered very short for a little girl. And it was reported that she often wore yellow, and people went crazy over this. Mothers tore her out to the stores and had about every yellow outfit that they could find. It was the new phrase. George V was very austere. People actually were really afraid of him. And he had this really persona about him. But he and Elizabeth got along wonderfully. She called him Grandpa England, and he called her Lilibet. So they really had a great time together. She did learn to curtsy by the age of 3, because because she was so unafraid of him that the Archbishop was taken back when he came in and saw her pulling on his beard.
Wasn't his wife Mary pretty stern also?
Oh, yes. Yes, Mary. Both of them were really stern, hard individuals. Oh. And whenever she would leave her grandfather, she would always curtsy and say, "I trust your majesty shall sleep well." So she learned good manners for her grandfather. Even though they loved each other, she still had to do that because she was a princess and he was the king. But for her 4th birthday, he gave her first pony, Peggy. And that's one thing we're going to talk about on Friday, her great love of racehorses. And she loves horses. She only quit, she's 95 now, and only 5 years ago did she stop riding horses. She loves horses. And she owns a whole stable of racing horses. And all it goes back to her grandfather, giving her the first pony. 1929, she appeared for the first time on the cover of Time. She was a really cute little girl. And she was referred to as the Roguish Princess. Roguish Princess. Now you're going to be shocked what she said at this age. And you're going to see why. She was rebuked for using the term "my goodness" within earshot of her mother. Isn't that just terrible? How could a little child ever do that? But you see, that's royalty for you. When she was 7, the nanny that they had all this time, they asked her, they resigned her, and they got Marion Crawford. Marion Crawford had been a teacher, and she had studied child psychology, but she had never been a nanny before. And when they looked at her qualifications, they thought she'd be good. And she was with them for a long time, she and Margaret. And they called her Coffee as a child. After Elizabeth's wedding, Coffee was no longer their nanny or their kid. And so the American magazine, the Ladies' Home Journal, offered her, or asked her to write a series of stories about bringing up Elizabeth and Margaret. And she agreed to do that. They were compiled and put into a book called The Little Princesses. The Queen, Elizabeth's mother, was furious that they told personal items of this. They had, when she had retired, they had given her a house on the grounds, and they took it away from her. And she went and lived up in Scotland, I think it was, and they never spoke to her again. And when she died, and they had been madly in love with her, and when she died, they even sent a condolence card or flowers. And anytime somebody breaks the confidence of the royal family, it's called doing a Coffee because of this. They have long memories. Elizabeth's Day was this. She and Margaret, remember Margaret's younger than she is, had lessons from 9:30 until 11. They studied English, French, and history. In the afternoon, they played games, took dancing and singing lessons. Okay, anybody want to comment on her education? Lessons from 9:30 to 11, English, French, and history, and they had outdoor games. Do you notice
Well,
that,
what about math?
pardon?
What about math?
No math.
Oh.
What else are they missing?
Reading, writing, and arithmetic. So writing,
No, that's a good, writing is an interesting one, because we're gonna come to that in a minute. Yeah, but you're right. What else is she missing? Science. No math, no science, no current events. She was very poorly educated.
but no girls would have been taught science in that day.
Oh, right, absolutely. This was, what girls of her class
Yes.
would have been educated. Notice that they're doing dancing and singing in outdoor games. So it's very much an education of her time. But still, she is third in line to the throne. Her grandmother, Queen Mary, and somebody said about her being, really stiff, she is, really expressed her concern about this educational upbringing. She thought, maybe she could be queen sometime. Maybe she should get a better education. And the Duchess of York, her mother, said that her parents had considered it more important to prepare their daughters to make good marriages. Now that certainly would not be today, would it? And then I love the next line. She said, I and my sisters all married well, and some of us very well. She had married a prince. Even from the age, Elizabeth has always lived a very meticulous life, and she was very organized. Every night when she went to bed, she organized her shoes. I'm lucky if I get my shoes off and throw them under the bed, let alone be organized. But they said that she'd get up in the middle of the night, and in case they had been moved, she would rearrange them. She was very obsessed with this. 3 weeks ago I had COVID, and I'm still having a cough. I'm fine. So, Queen Mary said that a great betrayal occurred. In 1936, King George died. Thank you. King George died, and he was succeeded to the throne by Edward VIII. Now, Edward VIII was Prince of Wales, and everybody had assumed that he would be a marvelous king. He was extremely popular, but he had abdicated. Go back one. He abdicated the throne. And for, remember who? Right, Wally Simpson. And the whole issue was that she was divorced, an American divorcee. At the time, that was not allowed. Divorce was not allowed. Which leads to an interesting comment about today, because who is divorced?
Charles.
Camellia, who's married to Charles, And so, they now her father becomes Edward VIII. He did not want to be king. He had not been prepped to be a king. He had never seen a state paper. He knew nothing. They had never practiced with it. And in fact, when Edward resigned because of Wally, that's the farewell address. There they were together. It's the first picture that was published, named them, by the way. People protested in the streets that they wanted Edward to be retained, to be brought back, and they just simply wouldn't. And George became king. Again, he didn't want to become king at all. And when he learned that Edward had abdicated, he actually went to his mother and cried.
Oh.
He did not want it. He had not been trained. Plus, if you remember the King's Speech, the movie The King's Speech, you remember? He stuttered. He had a terrible time talking. And he just simply did not want to become king.
Excuse me, but why had Edward not been trained? Was there an older son that something happened?
Yeah, Edward VIII was trained to become king, and George was not.
No, but wasn't it Edward VIII you said didn't want to be king?
No, George.
Oh,
When Edward abdicated, George didn't want to become king, right? And suddenly, Elizabeth becomes the heir presumptive to the throne. They had not expected this at all. Remember, she was not very well educated at this point. Now, I've got a really interesting question. You've been doing real well with the questions today, by the way. Why was she the heir presumptive and not the heir apparent?
they could still have a boy child.
Right.
Take over.
They could still have a boy child.
Gee.
And at that time, the law was, it was primogeniture, a boy child. And so her parents still could have had a boy child. So she's the presumptive heir, not the apparent heir. Right? Her parent, that was exactly right.
Yeah.
And there's the coronation. Prophet complained that at Buckingham House, they all know how to move to Buckingham House, was like camping in a museum. Again, they weren't prepared for this. They had not spent time even contemplating on moving. They actually waited a while, a few months till they actually moved into Buckingham Palace. Elizabeth and Margaret now had a detective that followed them everywhere. They had not had that before. And their meals were now served by 2 footmen in scarlet livery in the nursery. Does that tell you what royalty's like? Wonderful. And the princesses no longer called their parents mommy and Hal. They now had to call them the king and the queen. They never again referred to their parents as mommy and Hal. Elizabeth, now Queen Elizabeth, her mother was crowned queen. Remember to keep your temper and your word and be loving. It was great advice. Great advice. Never shout or frighten, or you will lose their delightful trust in you. And then Sir Henry Martin, who was the vice provost of Eton, was brought in to start to educate her better. Because if she's going to be the queen, and she had a very poor education, they really needed her to catch up. And the Constitution of Britain is very complicated. Do you know why it's different than our Constitution?
Years ago, it was set up years ago, wasn't it?
I'll give you a half yes on that. She said, set up years ago. Why is their Constitution so different than ours?
Because we're smarter.
Pardon?
We're smarter.
We are
Smarter.
Oh, we're smart. No.
The monarchy.
Good idea, but no.
They had a king.
Yes. That really is a good
It's
answer.
the monarchy versus a democracy.
That's true. The real good reason is we have a written constitution. They don't. Every law and every legal decision is considered the Constitution. They have no written document like we do. It's every law and every legal decision. So therefore, in order to understand the Constitution or how the government ran, she had to start studying all this law. And for religious purposes, the Archbishop of Canterbury took over. And then,
Well, she would become certain, they had a Church of England.
yes, yeah, that's why she had to have the, yeah, you're right. 1939 and war in Europe occurred. The whole idea was they wanted to get the children out of London. They really were pushing for that. Why?
We're bombing one mile.
Yeah, they were so afraid that Hitler was going to bomb London, which he did, and they wanted to get the children out of London, up basically anywhere in the country, up to Scotland. But the safest place to take the children was Canada.
Oh, where?
Canada. Canada. So they took an awful lot of children to Canada. And they had this, the Queen said, the children would not go without me, I would not leave the King, and the King would never go. They stayed. The King and Queen stayed in London. They stayed in Buckingham Palace during the week. They didn't on weekends. They went somewhere else on weekends. The princesses stayed first at Balmoral, which is up in Scotland. That was the safest place. But they then moved them to Sandringham House, and then they finally settled in at Windsor Castle. Now, Windsor Castle is right near, it's about 12 miles outside of London. So they were very close to their parents. Their parents stayed in September, or stayed in London, and they lived in Windsor. And that's what Windsor Castle looks like. Doesn't look like a castle, really, does it?
Looks like a little city.
Yeah, and it really is. It truly is a little city. It's so big. And there they are at Windsor Castle. Now they're in their teens. January 8th, 1940, the Queen was removing an eyelash from George's eye, and they heard this terrible racket outside. It was coming, they heard boom, 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 and the Germans bombed Buckingham Palace. They almost killed the King and Queen.
Wow.
It was that dangerous. They did horrible damage to Buckingham Palace. But the Queen said that she was so glad. There you can see the hole in Buckingham Palace, one of the bombs went off. Because she said now she could go out among the people that she had also been bombed. And George and Elizabeth every day went to London's disaster areas. They were very, very good about this. October 13th, Elizabeth makes her first public broadcast by radio, and she says, all of us children who are still at home think continually of our friends and relations who have gone overseas, Canada. My sister is by my side, and we are both going to say goodnight to you. Come on, Margaret. Good night. And that was the first time that the people of Britain heard her actually speak. At the end of the broadcast, the king rushed in and exclaimed, she's exactly like her, meaning Queen Elizabeth, his wife. She was an excellent radio speaker, and she often spoke much more often than George ever did. George hated to speak, and so she did a lot of broadcasting. Her first public appearance was to inspect troops in 1942. She had been appointed an honorary colonel in chief of the Grenadier Guards, and she did that. However, they did have some leisure up at Windsor Castle during the war years. Oh. They put on pantomimes at Christmas time. While they were at Windsor, Alethea Fitzalan Howard was her closest friend. And so they started a Girls' Guide troupe that had been at Buckingham Palace. They now continued at Windsor. Girls' Guide. Give it another name.
Girl Scouts.
Yes, Girl Scouts. It's what they call Girl Scouts. So they had a Girls' Guide troupe at Buckingham Palace. They did the same now at Windsor. And I love this. We cook soup and Irish stew. Lilibet is never at her best with a lot of people, but then I suppose no one else is. She wasn't a very good cook, is what she's saying. The same girl says, I had tea with the king and queen and the princesses. We went to the Waterloo Chamber after for the film Casablanca. Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman. Mine is my all-time favorite movie. went to the castle for the pantomime at 2:30. It was certainly the best they'd ever done. The clothes and scenery were beautiful. And notice they had the best theater people come in and make the sets and make their costumes for them. And now there was a great publicity, a great deal of publicity was given when the princesses were immunized against diphtheria. People were not having their children immunized. And diphtheria was a terrible problem during the bombing. And so they publicly had both princesses immunized. 1944, she was now 18 years old, and she had her first royal duty. She launched the HMS, the ship, the Vanguard, and there she is, you can see her. So she's now spoken publicly. She has now been seen publicly watching the troops, and now she has dedicated a ship. And then she joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service. Now, this was one of the women's auxiliaries during the war. It was a very important one because the women in this took on male jobs such as driving ambulances, changing tires, driving transport troops, fixing and repairing trucks. And she joined this group. She wanted to, and her parents said no. And finally, when she was 18, they allowed her to do this. And this is where she learned to drive. And she learned how to change a spark plug. By the way, driving is important. We're going to find out about that in a little bit. She was the first and only female ever to be in the active armed services.
Oh.
Okay, males in the past have been, but no female had ever been. And during her 6-week course, she learned how to repair engines, change tires, and drive the vehicles she worked on. And she has done that all of her life. When her car breaks down, she knows what's wrong with it. She's that talented. However, she didn't eat with the rest of the women. She ate the officer's tent, and they transported her back to Windsor Castle every evening. So she did have a few privileges there. Following the war, the royal family took their first overseas trip. They needed to make sure that they were now being very public around the world. It was a 3-month tour of South Africa and Rhodesia. South Africa and Rhodesia at the time were part of the Commonwealth. And so they went there. And it was there she celebrates her 21st birthday, and she made her first broadcast to the whole Commonwealth, in which she said something very important. There is a motto which has been borne by many of my ancestors, a noble motto, I serve. Isn't that unbelievable for now thinking that she served 70 years? I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong. So she, on her 21st birthday, dedicated herself to the long service of her country. November 20th, 1947, the royal wedding. And she's going to marry. Who is she marrying? Philip Mountbatten. Philip. Now, Philip had a very checkered background. He was actually a prince of Greece and Denmark. His grandfather had been put on the throne of Greece. It was a Danish prince, and been put on the throne of Greece, and they were overthrown. And he, and his parents, and he and his sisters had to escape Greece so that they weren't going to be killed in it. Somebody once asked him, was he the Prince of Greece? And he said, no, I'm Philip, just Philip. That's all. The house of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonneberg, Bergsburg, that was the house that he actually came from. And his grandfather had been the prince, a Danish prince. His parents, his father had served in the army. His mother was a great-granddaughter of Queen Victoria. So you see, he's very well born. Her father was Admiral George Battenberg, who during World War I had anglicized their name to Mountbatten.
Oh,
Okay? So because Battenberg was too German, they changed their name to Mountbatten. Following the Greco-Turkish War, the royal family was in exile. They were kicked out of Greece, and he was carried in a crib made from a fruit basket, fruit crate. And the family had no money. They were just deadly poor. And they were just bounced back and forth between relatives. His mother had a mental condition. She was put into an institution, and because she was considering suicide. She finally declared herself to be a saint.
oh.
His father divorced her and left for Monte Carlo with his mistress and lived there until he died. His sisters all married German princes, and they were all Nazis. So you see, his background is really shaky here. He was taken finally under the protection of George Mountbatten, his uncle, and then when George died, Louis Mountbatten took over. He went to Gordonstoun boarding school in Scotland, and there he is. And the play was Hamlet, by the way. That was his costume. And then he got an appointment at the Royal Naval Academy at Dartmouth for him. And this is where they're going to first meet. 8-year-old Elizabeth and 13-year-old Philip meet for the very first time at their cousin's, Princess Marina's marriage to the Duke of York. So it was his cousin, Princess Marina, was marrying her uncle, the Duke of Kent. And that was the first time they ever saw each other. They were third cousins, so they were related. And both of them were great-great-grandchildren of Queen Victoria. 5 years pass, and they meet again. The royal family is at Dartmouth, and guess who the person was put in charge to look over the daughters? Philip. And so once again, Elizabeth meets Philip. And it was at this time that she started to fall in love with him. During the war, they corresponded. He served in the Navy. He was a very good naval officer. And in fact, in 1943, he came to Balmoral for Christmas. And again, they saw each other. So they're writing each other, they're keeping pictures of each other. They are in love with each other. After the war, they tried their best to be discreet. So if they went out to eat or if they went into the theater, she would go in one vehicle, he'd go in another vehicle, and then they'd sit beside each other. They went to see the favorite show at the time, Oklahoma, and People Will Say We're in Love became their song. And all their lives they had that played for them. Now, for the first time, now remember we said that the royal family after the war is going to go to South Africa. Well, the reason why they wanted Elizabeth to go along was they didn't like him. Her parents didn't like him at all. And so they wanted her to forget him. And so they take her to South Africa. However, she didn't forget him. And so on her 21st birthday, they finally agreed that they could marry. And 79 days later, it was made public. It was with greatest pleasure, and it wasn't great pleasure, believe me, that the King and Queen announced the betrothal of their beloved daughter, the Princess Elizabeth, to Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten. And that was the ring that he gave her. It was actually from her tiara that Tsar Nicholas and Tsarina Alexandria, remember they'd been killed, had given her for their wedding. And so they reset all the stones. And if you see a picture, look at her hand, and she wears this almost all the time. Well, what did he have to give up in order to marry her? And he did have to give up his titles.
Yes, and his,
He couldn't be prince. He could no longer be in line to the Greek throne. And most importantly, he had been raised Greek Orthodox. And he had to convert to Anglican and be baptized Anglican. But while he gave up stuff, he also got a few things. He got the titles Duke of Edinburgh, Earl of Marinoff, and Baron of Greenwich. So the king granted him those titles.
but not right away, did he? Didn't he have to wait?
It was a little bit, it was right before the wedding, so there was a time break there, yeah. Norman Rockwell was to design the gown, and he said, to me, simplicity is the death of soul. Hartnell loved fancy things. And he designed the gown based on a Botticelli painting called Primavera. And it's based on that painting. Not all the nakedness, by the way. It's all the flowers. And that's what it looked like. Now the problem was, there's still, remember, right after the war, and there's still restrictions. And so she had saved up all of her clothing coupons in order to have the gown made. But it needed 3,000 coupons, and she didn't have enough. And when it was published that she needed more, people began to send, women sent her their coupons. The problem was, according to law, you had to be the actual owner of a coupon in order to use it. You couldn't give it to somebody else. So she thanked them and sent them all back, and the government gave her 200 more, and she got her gown, and there it is. It took them 3 months to make the gown. The train was 13 feet long. It took 350 women 7 weeks to apply 10,000 seed pearls. And actually I saw a documentary on this, and I saw them hand sewing this. It took them forever. They worked night and day. They worked in shifts to do this. Now, it was done in silk, and there was a rumor that silk was either Italian or Japanese. Now, what's the problem there?
Fighting the Japanese.
Yeah,
Pardon?
We're fighting the Japanese.
they were
Yeah.
just, you know.
It's just after the war, they're furious over this, and they didn't want this. And so they had to say, no, it's Chinese. And there was a 4-leaf clover on her skirt so that she could touch it for good luck. I think that's kind of a nice little trick. The tiara was what's called the French tiara, and there it is. And her mother had worn it. And there were 2 tragedies on the wedding day. 2 hours before the service, the tiara broke. They had a royal jeweler that lived right in Buckingham Palace, and he replaced it. But if you look at it, now look to the left. You see that little break? See where that's not quite right? He repaired it as good as he could, but that was. And then she had 2 strands of pearls that her parents had given her, and she forgot back to St. James Palace where she was staying at the time. And so her private secretary rushed by car, but there were so many people on the road waiting to see the procession that he had to get out of the car, and he ran the rest of the way, grabbed the pearls, and got them back in time for her. And the Queen's wedding ring was made from a nugget of Welsh gold. And since then, all royal marriages have that Welsh gold in it. The cake was 9 feet tall, and because they were still under all this rationing, they couldn't bake the cake. And so all the Commonwealth nations sent the supplies for the cake. And it was called the 10,000-mile cake because of that.
Don't step out and build it there.
She had 8 bridesmaids and 2,000 guests. It was a very little private wedding, as you can see. And it was broadcast by radio. 42 to 42 countries, they actually heard it. Noah Powell said, English tradition at its best. There was one controversy, though, about the wedding. Elizabeth pledged to obey. What's the problem?
She's the
She's
Someone who wasn't royal.
She's the queen. She shouldn't be obeying Philip. Right. She promised that. The Duke of Windsor saved his favorite niece's wedding day at a suite in the Waldorf Towers. He was not invited. Because, remember, he was Edward VIII and had abdicated, you know, so she was mad. She was not invited to the wedding. And that's where we end today. That's the wedding. Okay. Questions and comments?
It was wonderful.
Thank you.
Comment.
Yeah.
I have
Can I
had
turn
the
on the light?
occasion, I have had the occasion to go in Windsor Castle
Oh, yeah.
many years ago, into the room where they have all the crown jewels.
Uh-huh.
Cameras did go, you could, but the cameras stayed out.